The cold vacuum of space meant nothing to Captain as he stood on the bridge of his longship, the Howl. His ancestors had crossed frozen seas in wooden vessels, guided only by stars and courage. Now he crossed the void between worlds in a ship forged from quantum steel and powered by stellar fusion, but the spirit remained unchanged. The blood of Vikings flowed through his veins, and with it came an insatiable hunger for exploration and conquest. The bridge of this Howl bore little resemblance to the sleek, sterile command centers of other human vessels. Ancient runes carved from meteorite iron lined the walls, their surfaces glowing with soft blue light from embedded quantum circuits. A massive hammer, replica of itself, hung suspended above the captain's chair, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their voices calling out navigation reports and sensor readings in a mixture of standard galactic and Old Norse. "Captain," called out, his second-in-command and the ship's navigator. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned her position through blood and battle, not politics or favoritism. "Long-range sensors are detecting artificial structures in the Vega system. The configuration matches no known human or alien architecture." His weathered face broke into a grin that would have been familiar to his ancestors, who had first spotted the shores of unknown lands across dark waters. "How many vessels in the fleet?" 12 longships, all reporting ready for whatever awaits us, Captain." Fingers danced across her console, calling up holographic displays that showed the disposition of their raiding fleet. Each ship bore the name of a creature from the old stories. Skoil, Sprint, Flight, and others that spoke of humanity's refusal to abandon its roots even among the stars. The discovery had come 3 months ago when human deep space probe designated Odin's Eye had detected energy signatures from the Vega system, that explanation. The readings suggested a civilization with technology far beyond anything humanity had encountered, including the various alien species that made up the Galactic Council. Most human commanders would have reported the findings to Earth Command and waited for orders. Was not most commanders. He had gathered his fleet of independent human raiders, men and women who traced their lineage back to the Scandinavian colonies on Europa and Titan. These were people who had never forgotten that their ancestors had been warriors and explorers, who had carved their names into history with axe and sword and iron will. They called themselves the chosen slain, and they answered to no authority but their own code of honor. Called to his weapon's master, a giant of a man whose arms bore the scars of 100 battles. "What do our war spirits tell us about the defenses?" The weapons master consulted his displays, reading the ancient runes that his people had adapted for modern warfare. "The energy patterns suggest defensive systems, Captain, but nothing our ancestors couldn't handle. The Thunderhammer batteries are charged and ready. The teeth are sharp." Nodded, understanding the metaphor. This Howl carried weapons that human military scientists had declared impossible to build, devices that channeled the same forces that powered stars themselves. They had been constructed in the hidden shipyards of the outer colonies, where human ingenuity had been freed from the cautious oversight of Earth's bureaucrats. As the fleet approached the inner system, the true nature of their discovery became clear. Vega Prime was entirely covered by artificial structures, a world transformed into something that resembled a vast mechanical organism. Crystalline spires stretched into space, connected by bridges of pure energy that pulsed with colors that had no names in human language. Most striking of all were the guardians that moved between the structures, beings of living metal that flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining shapes that suggested both beauty and terrible purpose. "By the Allfather's Eye," whispered Olaf the Young, the fleet's youngest captain and commander of the Sprint. His voice carried across the fleet communication channels and could hear the mixture of awe and anticipation that every true raider felt when facing the unknown. The alien constructs took notice of the approaching human fleet with a speed that suggested advanced sensor networks spanning the entire system. 12 vessels emerged from the crystalline spires, each one a work of art that moved through space like living sculpture. They were beautiful in the way that ice formations were beautiful, perfect, and cold, and utterly alien to human understanding. "Incoming transmission, Captain," reported the far speaker, the fleet's communications officer. "The signal is complex, but our translation matrices are finding patterns." The shimmered and suddenly found himself looking at something that might once have been alive, but had transcended such simple categories. The being appeared to be constructed from crystalline segments that shifted and reformed as it spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass human ears and speak directly to the mind. "Unknown vessels," the entity said, its words carrying an undertone of music that was both beautiful and unsettling. "You have entered the domain of the architects. We are the builders of worlds, the shapers of reality itself. Your technology is primitive, your understanding limited. You will withdraw to your own region of space and forget what you have seen here." Felt the familiar stirring in his blood, the same feeling his ancestors had known when faced with wealthy monasteries on distant shores or the walls of foreign cities. Here was something worth taking, worth fighting for, worth the songs that would be sung of this day until the end of time. "I am, son of Thor, heir to the Stormbringers and the Wave Riders. My people have sailed every sea and walked on every world where humans have set foot. We bow to no king, no emperor, and certainly no self-proclaimed architect." His voice carried across the void with the authority of someone who had never learned to back down from a fight. The crystalline being's form shifted, taking on configurations that suggested displeasure or perhaps confusion. "Your species designation suggests you are human, but our records indicate humans are a cautious species, preferring negotiation to conflict. You do not match the behavioral parameters." Laughed, the sound sharp as breaking ice. "Then your records are incomplete, construct. We are the sons and daughters of the Storm Riders, and we have never learned the meaning of impossible." The alien vessels began to move in formation, their movements precise and coordinated in a way that spoke of perfect artificial intelligence. Each ship was larger than the human longships, their hulls gleaming with the same crystalline substance that covered their home world. Energy began to build along their edges, creating patterns of light that were beautiful and clearly threatening. "Captain," called from his weapons console, "their energy signatures are building to attack configuration. They mean to destroy us." His hand moved to the replica of that hung above his command chair, feeling the weight of history and tradition in its iron grip. Around the bridge, his crew prepared for battle with the calm efficiency of people who had been born for this moment. In the depths of the ship, the fusion reactors began to sing their song of controlled stellar fire. "Then we'll give them a battle worthy of song," declared, his voice carrying to every ship in the fleet. "Today we face beings who believe themselves gods. Today we remind the universe that humanity has never knelt to any god, no matter how powerful." The first shots of the battle came from the architects, beams of coherent energy that struck the lead human ships with enough force to vaporize a small moon. But they had not come unprepared. Ancient defensive technologies, based on principles their ancestors had discovered in the ruins of long-dead civilizations, turned the impossible energies aside like rain from a warrior's shield. This howl responded with its own weapons, devices that channeled the fury of dying stars and hurled it across space with accuracy that the laws of physics as most species understood them. The first architect vessel to be struck simply ceased to exist, its crystalline perfection reduced to scattered atoms in the space of a heartbeat. Around the flagship, the other longships of the fleet moved with coordination born of centuries of raiding together. They were outnumbered but not outmatched, their weapons forged from desperation and human stubbornness, their crews trained in tactics that had been developed by people who refused to accept that any enemy was unbeatable. The battle raged across the Vega system, a dance of destruction that lit up the void with energies that had not been seen since the birth of the galaxy. The architects fought with the cold precision of perfect machines, but the humans fought with something their enemies could not understand or counter, the burning certainty that they were exactly where they belonged, doing exactly what they had been born to do. As this coil destroyed its second enemy vessel with a weapon that turned matter into pure energy and back again, felt the familiar joy that came with a battle well fought. This was what his people lived for, the moment when skill and courage met the unknown and emerged victorious. But even as the human fleet carved its way through the alien defenders, his mind was already working on the larger picture. The architects were clearly more advanced than humanity, their technology based on principles that human science was only beginning to understand. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that superior technology was enough to ensure victory. They had never faced an enemy that simply refused to lose. The last of the defending vessels fell to combined fire from 3 human longships, its crystalline hull cracking like ice under the assault of weapons that channeled forces older than civilization. In the sudden silence that followed, could hear his crew breathing hard, their hearts pounding with the aftermath of battle. "Damage report," he called out, though he could already see from his displays that his fleet had come through the engagement with relatively minor losses. One ship, the Tyr's Sacrifice, had taken heavy damage but remained operational. The others bore only the scars that made a warrior proud. "Minimal casualties, Captain," reported, "but I'm reading massive energy buildup from the planet's surface. They're preparing something big." Studied the sensor readings, watching as power levels on the crystalline world below rose to levels that measurement. Whatever the architects were planning, it would make their ship-based defenses look like toys by comparison. "All ships prepare for planetary assault," he ordered, knowing that his words would be recorded for history. "Today we claim a world that gods call home. Today we prove that humanity will never be contained." As the 12 longships of the fleet moved toward Vega Prime, their hulls gleaming with the light of stars and their weapons charged with the fury of ancient storms, felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. His ancestors had conquered lands and seas, but he would conquer something far greater. He would conquer the impossible itself. The surface of Vega Prime, everything had thought he understood about planetary engineering. As this howl descended through the atmosphere, he could see that the entire world had been transformed into a single vast machine, its surface covered with crystalline structures that reached toward the heavens like the fingers of sleeping giants. Rivers of liquid energy flowed between the spires, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human minds were equipped to process. "Captain," called from her station, her voice tight with concentration as she struggled to make sense of the sensor readings. "I'm detecting movement throughout the city world below. Millions of the constructs, maybe billions, and something else. Something massive in the planet's core." Leaned forward in his command chair, studying the holographic displays that showed the impossible architecture spreading out beneath them. Each building seemed to be alive, its crystalline surfaces shifting and flowing like water while maintaining structural integrity that should have been impossible. The very air around the spires shimmered with energy fields that bent light and space in ways that made his eyes water. "Sir," interrupted from his weapons console, his hands dancing across controls that had been carved with runes of power and protection. "The planetary defense grid is activating. Energy levels are climbing beyond anything in our databases." The first sign of the planet's awakening came as a deep vibration that could feel in his bones, a sound like the breathing of some unimaginably vast creature. The crystalline spires began to glow brighter, their surfaces pulsing in perfect synchronization as power flowed through conduits that spanned continents. Then the real defenses revealed themselves. Beams of energy erupted from the surface, each one carrying enough force to split moons. They moved with impossible precision, tracking the human fleet as it maneuvered through the upper atmosphere. But they had not survived centuries of raiding by being easy targets. The longships scattered like leaves in a storm wind, their pilots calling on skills passed down through generations of void walkers and star sailors. "Flight is taking fire," came the urgent transmission from Captain the Bold. "Their targeting systems are unlike anything we've faced. They're predicting our evasion patterns." Gripped the arms of his command chair, feeling this howl shudder as it dodged between energy beams that could have vaporized small asteroids. Around him, his crew worked with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained together for decades, their movements precise despite the chaos erupting around them. "All ships pattern," he commanded, using the code name for their most desperate battle formation. It was a tactic that traded safety for striking power, bringing the fleet together in a tight formation that could punch through almost any defense but left them vulnerable to concentrated fire. The 12 longships of the fleet moved as one, their crews united by bonds forged in the fires of 100 battles. As they descended toward the surface of Vega Prime, they unleashed their own weapons, devices that channeled forces their ancestors had discovered in the ruins of civilizations that had died before humanity learned to make fire. The first volley from the human fleet struck the surface installations with devastating effect. Ancient weapons, built using principles that violated every law of physics known to modern science, tore through crystalline structures that had stood for. Entire sections of the city world cracked and shattered, their perfect geometries reduced to chaos by the fury of human desperation. But the architects were far from defenseless. As the human attack carved its way through their outer defenses, the planet itself began to respond. The ground beneath the crystalline spires started to shift and flow, revealing mechanisms that had been hidden in the planet's crust. Massive constructs began to emerge, beings of living metal and crystallized energy that dwarfed the largest human vessels. "By Thor's hammer," whispered Olaf the Young over the fleet communications, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "They're bigger than mountains." The largest of the planetary guardians stood nearly a kilometer tall, its body a constantly shifting sculpture of crystal and metal that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. As it moved, space itself seemed to bend around it, creating distortions that made instruments scream warnings about gravitational anomalies. "Captain," called the far speaker from her communications station, "I'm detecting a new transmission from the surface. The pattern is different, more complex than before." The Maine shimmered and found himself looking at something that definitely had once been alive. Unlike the cold perfection of the previous architect he had encountered, this being showed signs of having been organic before its transformation into crystalline immortality. Its face, if it could be called that, bore expressions that spoke of eons of accumulated wisdom and terrible purpose. "I am the prime constructor," the being said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very structure of reality. "I was the first to transcend the limitations of flesh, the first to achieve perfect existence. Your species clings to primitiveness, to the chaos of biological existence. We offer you ascension." Felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold of space. He had heard offers like this before, from beings who claimed to offer humanity a better way of existence. They always ended with humans becoming something other than human. "We've had that conversation with others," replied, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. "The collective offered us unity, the harmonizers offered us peace, the transcended offered us enlightenment. They all had one thing in common: they wanted us to stop being human." The prime constructor's crystalline features shifted, taking on patterns that suggested confusion or perhaps pity. "Your attachment to biological existence is irrational. Flesh is weak, prone to disease and decay. Emotion is chaos, preventing optimal decision-making. We can offer you perfection." Around the bridge of this howl's crew exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had all heard variations of this speech before, from a dozen different species that claimed to have found the secret of perfect existence. The outcome was always the same: the loss of everything that made life worth living. "You know what I think about perfection?" asked, his hand moving to the hammer of his ancestors. "I think it's another word for death. My people have a saying: better to die with sword in hand than live forever as someone else's idea of perfect." The prime constructor's form began to pulse with brighter energy, its perfect features showing what might have been anger if it still possessed such primitive emotions. "Then you choose extinction over evolution. So be it." The city world below erupted into motion as billions of architect constructs began to move with unified purpose. The air filled with crystalline drones, each one beautiful and deadly, their formations creating patterns that spoke of intelligence beyond human comprehension. At the same time, the massive planetary guardians began to advance, their footsteps causing earthquakes that could be felt even in orbit. But they had not come this far to be turned back by superior numbers or advanced technology. As the architect forces mobilized, the human fleet began its own transformation. Hulls that had appeared to be simple metal revealed hidden complexities, surfaces shifting to expose weapons systems that had been disguised as decorative elements. Called out, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Time to show these architects what human engineering can accomplish. Give them the full fury of the storm." The weapons master's face split into a grin that would have terrified a demon. "Aye, Captain, may our ancestors witness this day." This howl unleashed its full arsenal, weapons that channeled forces from the hearts of dying stars and the depths of black holes. The first planetary guardian to face the human flagship simply ceased to exist, its kilometer-tall form reduced to scattered atoms by energies that violated every law of physics the architects thought they understood. Around the flagship, the other longships of the fleet opened fire with their own impossible weapons. The coil fired bolts of crystallized time itself, aging enemy constructs to dust in seconds. The sprint moved through space using principles that allowed it to be in multiple locations simultaneously, its attacks coming from directions that should not have existed. But perhaps most devastating was the Tyr's sacrifice, the ship that had been damaged in the earlier battle. Its captain, had made a decision that epitomized everything the stood for. Rather than retreat for repairs, he had ordered his crew to overload every system on the ship, turning it into a weapon of mass destruction. For Midgard's voice rang out across the fleet communications as his ship dove straight into the largest concentration of enemy forces. For humanity's future. The explosion that followed lit up the Vega system like a new star being born. When the light faded, a crater several kilometers wide marked the spot where hundreds of architect constructs had been standing. The surviving human ships pressed their advantage, diving deep into the city world's defenses while the enemy reeled from the unexpected sacrifice. Felt tears on his cheeks as he watched the last signals from the Tyr's sacrifice fade from his screens. And his crew had chosen the warrior's death, the ending that every true hoped for when their time came. Their sacrifice would be remembered in song until the last human drew breath. "Captain," called, her voice urgent, "I'm detecting massive energy buildup in the planet's core. Whatever they're planning, it's big enough to crack the world in half." Studied the sensor readings, watching power levels climb to readings that measurement. The architects were preparing to sacrifice their own world rather than allow humans to claim it. A move that spoke of either incredible dedication to their cause or terror at what humanity represented. "Then we finish this before they can complete their preparations," declared, knowing that his words would determine the fate of his fleet. "All ships target the primary power conduits. We're going to the heart of their city world." The remaining 11 ships of the fleet dove toward the surface of Vega Prime, dodging between energy beams and crystalline drones as they sought the power sources that fed the planet's defenses. As they descended, could see the true scope of what the architects had built, a world-sized machine designed to reshape reality itself, to impose their vision of perfection on the chaos of the universe. The central spire of the city world rose from the planet's surface like a needle piercing the sky, its crystalline length extending far into space. At its base, could see conduits of pure energy that fed power to every system on the planet. It was beautiful in the way that glaciers were beautiful, perfect and cold and utterly inhuman. "There," said, pointing at the base of the massive spire, "that's where we make our stand. That's where we prove that humanity cannot be perfected." As this howl led the final assault toward the heart of the architect's city world, felt the weight of history on his shoulders. His ancestors had faced impossible odds before, standing against enemies that claimed to be gods or demons or forces of nature. They had always found a way to win, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through sheer human stubbornness and the refusal to accept defeat. The final battle was about to begin and was exactly where he belonged, at the front of the charge with his crew at his side and his enemies ahead. Whatever happened next, the universe would remember that humanity had been here, that they had fought, and that they had never learned to kneel. The heart of the architect's city world pulsed with energies that had been building since the dawn of their civilization. As led his remaining fleet toward the central spire, he could feel the planet itself trembling beneath the weight of power that threatened to tear reality apart. The massive crystalline tower stretched impossibly high, its surface covered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change even as he watched, creating illusions that made his eyes water and his head spin. "Captain," called from her navigation station, her voice strained as she fought to make sense of sensor readings that explanation. "The energy levels in that spire are beyond anything we've encountered. If they complete whatever they're building, the explosion will be visible from Earth." Studied the tactical displays, watching as the last of the planetary guardians moved to defend their most sacred site. The remaining architect forces were converging on the central spire with desperate purpose, their perfect formations speaking of minds linked in purpose that transcended individual existence. They moved like cells in a vast organism, each one perfectly coordinated with all the others. "Sir," called from weapons control, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. "Our ammunition stores are running low. We've expended nearly 70% of our exotic matter reserves in the fighting so far." The reality of their situation hit like a physical blow. The fleet had come further and fought harder than any human force in history, but they were still only 12 ships against an entire world. Their weapons, powerful as they were, drew on resources that could not be easily replaced in the middle of battle. "Then we make every shot count," replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had accepted that this might be their final battle. "Olaf, take the Sprint and 3 other ships around to the spire's eastern face. Create enough noise to draw their attention while we strike at the power conduits." The young captain's voice came back across the communication channels, steady despite his age and the enormity of what they faced. "Understood, Captain. If this is where we make our last stand, then by the gods, we'll make it memorable." As half the surviving fleet peeled away to begin their diversionary attack, turned his attention to the massive structure rising before them. The central spire was more than just a building. It was a monument to the architect vision of perfection, a statement in crystalline form that chaos must be replaced by order, that life must be replaced by eternal, static existence. The first sign that something fundamental was changing came as a deep vibration that felt in his bones, a sound like the planet itself crying out in pain. The crystalline surface of the spire began to crack, revealing a core of pure energy that burned with the light of a newborn star. Through the growing fissures, caught glimpses of something that made his blood run cold. Thousands of beings suspended in crystalline matrices, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal contentment. "They're not just building a weapon," he realized, speaking the words aloud as understanding dawned. "They're preparing to transform every living thing in the galaxy into one of them." The full horror of the architect plan became clear as more of the spire's interior was revealed. Each of the suspended beings had once been alive, representatives of a dozen different species that had encountered the architects over the. All of them wore the same expression of perfect peace, their minds wiped clean of everything that had made them unique individuals. Captain called from her communication station, her voice filled with disgust and fury. "I'm receiving transmissions from inside that structure. They're not dead, sir. They're still alive, still aware. They're trapped in there, conscious but unable to move or speak or be themselves anymore." Felt a rage building in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat of battle and everything to do with a fundamental violation of everything he held sacred. His ancestors had fought against tyranny and oppression, but they had never faced anything as monstrous as this, the complete destruction of free will itself. "All ships," he commanded, his voice carrying across the communication channels with the authority of absolute conviction. "New primary objective. We're not just stopping a weapon. We're ending a crime that has been going on for thousands of years." The Howl dove toward the base of the crystalline spire, its weapons systems targeting the massive energy conduits that fed power to the nightmare within. As the ship's exotic matter cannons opened fire, could see sections of the spire's base begin to crack and shatter, releasing some of the pressure that had been building inside. Around them, the remaining ships of the fleet pressed their attack with renewed fury. The knowledge of what the architects had been doing to their victims had transformed a battle for survival into a crusade for the very soul of free will itself. Each weapon discharge was aimed not just at victory, but at liberation for the countless beings trapped in crystalline prisons. The architects responded with everything they had remaining. The air around the spire filled with defensive drones, each one beautiful in its crystalline perfection and deadly beyond measure. Energy beams lanced out from hidden weapon systems, forcing the human ships to dance between threats that could vaporize them in seconds. But something had changed in the attacking fleet. Where before they had fought with the disciplined fury of professional warriors, now they fought with the desperate passion of people who had discovered an evil that could not be allowed to exist. The coil rammed straight through a formation of enemy drones, its captain choosing to take damage rather than waste time on evasive maneuvers. This flight used its sensors to target specific support structures, bringing down entire sections of defensive installations with precisely placed shots. "Captain," called out, her voice filled with excitement despite the chaos surrounding them. "The diversionary force is reporting success. They've breached the eastern power grid. Energy levels in the spire are becoming unstable." Could see it on his displays, watching as the perfect harmony of the architect systems began to break down. The crystalline spire was shaking now, its surface cracking as the energies within struggled against containment. Through the growing fissures, he could see the suspended beings beginning to stir, their crystalline prisons weakening as power was diverted to more critical systems. Commanded, "Target the primary control matrix. It's time to bring this nightmare to an end." The weapon's master nodded grimly, his hands moving across controls that had been blessed by priests and carved with runes of power. "Aye, Captain, may our ancestors witness this moment." The final barrage from this howl struck the heart of the architect control system with all the fury that human ingenuity could devise. Exotic matter warheads detonated inside the crystalline matrix, releasing energies that had been contained since the birth of the universe. For a moment, the spire blazed like a star, its perfect geometry dissolving into chaos as of carefully maintained order collapsed. Then the real miracle began. As the crystalline prisons began to fail, the beings trapped within started to move. Their faces, frozen in artificial contentment for so long, began to show expression again. Fear, confusion, anger, hope, all the messy, chaotic emotions that the architects had tried to eliminate forever. "Sir," called, her voice breaking with emotion, "I'm receiving communications from the freed prisoners. They remember everything. They've been aware the whole time, trapped in their own bodies, unable to move or speak or even scream." Felt tears on his cheeks as he watched the liberation unfolding around them. Representatives of species he had never seen before were pulling themselves from the wreckage of their crystalline prisons, their movements clumsy after eons of forced stillness, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The architect forces, seeing their perfect vision crumbling around them, made one final desperate attempt to preserve their work. The remaining planetary guardians began to converge on the central spire, their massive forms moving with purpose that suggested they would rather destroy everything than allow their order to be overthrown. "All ships," commanded, his voice filled with the kind of certainty that had driven his ancestors to cross unknown seas. "Protect the freed prisoners. Whatever it costs us, those beings are going home." The battle that followed was unlike anything in human military history. The fleet, reduced to 8 functioning ships, stood against enemies the size of mountains to protect beings they had never met, representatives of species they had never heard of. It was not strategic, it was not practical, and it was not particularly wise. It was purely, completely human. This sprint, badly damaged from the diversionary attack, positioned itself between a charging guardian and a group of freed prisoners who were still struggling to remember how to move. Captain Olaf, the young, could have retreated, could have saved his ship and crew, but instead he ordered full power to the forward shields and held his position until the last possible moment. The impact when the kilometer-tall Guardian struck the human ship was visible from orbit, but Olaf had bought the prisoners time to reach safety, and his sacrifice was not in vain. All across the battlefield, the other ships of the fleet were making similar choices, trading their own safety for the lives of beings they had never met. As the last of the architect guardians fell to combined fire from the remaining human ships, found himself looking out at a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before. The perfect crystalline city world was in ruins, its geometric perfection replaced by the chaos of genuine freedom. Thousands of liberated beings were moving through the wreckage, helping each other, sharing food and water and comfort in dozens of different languages. "Captain," called, her voice filled with wonder, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth Command. They've been monitoring our communications, and the news of what we've found here has reached the Galactic Council." Listened as reports flooded in from across human space. The revelation of what the architects had been doing to their victims had united every species in the galaxy in horror and determination. Fleets were already being assembled, forces that would ensure that no other world would ever suffer the fate of Vega Prime's prisoners. But perhaps most importantly, the freed beings were already beginning to form their own alliance, a confederation of species that had experienced the ultimate tyranny and survived. They called themselves the Liberated, and their first act was to offer permanent friendship to the human race that had broken their chains. "Sir," called from his weapons station, his voice filled with the kind of satisfaction that came from a job well done. "What are our orders now? Do we return to Earth?" Looked out at the ruined city world and the thousands of beings who were experiencing freedom for the first time in. Some of them were crying, some were laughing, and some were simply sitting in stunned silence as they tried to remember what it felt like to make their own choices. "No," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "Our work here isn't finished. These people need help getting home, and there might be other architect facilities out there with more prisoners. We're raiders, but we're also protectors. We'll see this through to the end." Around him, his crew nodded their agreement. They had come to the Vega system looking for adventure and glory, but they had found something much more important, a chance to make a difference in the lives of beings who had suffered beyond imagination. As this howl moved through the ruins of the crystalline city, felt the presence of his ancestors watching over him. They had conquered lands and seas, but he had conquered something far greater. He had taken freedom itself from the hands of those who would destroy it and given it back to those who deserved it. The battle was over, but the legend was just beginning. Songs would be sung of this day until the stars themselves grew cold, tales of the human raiders who had faced impossible odds and won not for their own glory, but for the freedom of beings they had never met. It was a victory that defined everything humanity stood for and everything they would never allow to be taken away. In the distance, the first rescue ships from the liberated Alliance were already arriving, their crews ready to begin the long process of helping the freed prisoners find their way home. The galaxy had been changed forever by what had happened here, and knew that his people would never again have to stand alone against the darkness. They had proven that some things were worth any sacrifice, and that humanity would never stop fighting for the right of every being to choose their own destiny. It was a lesson the universe would remember for all time.